She walked in as Margaret Collins, a bride of 3 months. She walked out as patient number 000, if she walked out at all. In 1874, Richmond, Virginia was dying. Yellow fever swept through the city like wildfire, claiming lives faster than gravediggers could work. The dead lined the streets, families abandoned their homes, and in the heart of this chaos stood Bellevue Medical Hospital, where the city's most desperate came, seeking salvation. But salvation had a price, and for Margaret Collins, that price would be everything she was. This is the story of America's most vanished bride, a woman who entered a fever ward with hope and emerged as something else entirely. Her identity erased, her memories gone, her very existence questioned. What happened behind those hospital walls? Why did a healthy young woman become the hospital's most mysterious patient? And why, 150 years later, are we still searching for answers? The truth lies buried in medical records that were never meant to see daylight, in testimony that was quickly silenced, in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Richmond society. Margaret Collins entered Bellevue Hospital on October 15, 1874. She was never seen again, but patient 000, she lived on for decades, trapped in a nightmare of forgotten identity and medical experimentation. This is her story. Richmond in 1874 was a city rebuilding itself from the ashes of war. The Civil War had ended 9 years earlier, but the scars remained. Poverty gripped the working class. Disease festered in overcrowded neighborhoods. And when yellow fever arrived that autumn, it found a city unprepared. Margaret Collins was 22 years old when she married Thomas Collins in July of 1874. The daughter of Irish immigrants, she worked as a seamstress in one of Richmond's textile mills. Thomas was a carpenter, building homes for families fleeing the fever-ravaged lower districts. Their wedding was small but joyful. Friends described Margaret as spirited and intelligent, with auburn hair and green eyes that sparked with laughter. She kept a detailed diary, writing about her dreams of starting a family and her excitement about their new life together. The Collins family lived in a modest home on Clay Street, just blocks from the James River. It should have been the beginning of a beautiful life. Instead, it became the prologue to one of medical history's darkest mysteries. By October 1874, yellow fever had claimed over 3,000 lives in Richmond. The disease struck without warning. Victims developed high fevers, violent nausea, and the telltale yellowing of skin that gave the plague its name. Most died within a week. On October 14th, Margaret began showing symptoms. The fever came first, then the chills that racked her body. Thomas found her collapsed in their kitchen, burning with heat but shivering uncontrollably. Desperate, he carried his bride to Bellevue Medical Hospital. It was the city's largest medical facility, run by Dr. Cornelius Whittemore, a respected physician who had studied in Europe and claimed revolutionary treatments for fever victims. Thomas left Margaret at the hospital that evening, promising to return the next morning. Hospital records show she was admitted as patient number 247, suffering from suspected yellow fever. It was the last time anyone would see Margaret Collins as herself. Bellevue Medical Hospital occupied an imposing 3-story brick building on Marshall Street. From the outside, it looked like salvation. Inside, it was something else entirely. Dr. Cornelius Whittemore had arrived in Richmond in 1871, bringing with him impressive credentials and revolutionary ideas about treating mental and physical ailments. He claimed to have studied under the famous German physician Franz Anton Mesmer, learning techniques for manipulating the human mind and memory. Whittemore's methods attracted attention from wealthy Richmond families, who paid enormous sums for his experimental treatments. But it was the fever epidemic that gave him access to something far more valuable than money: desperate patients with no one to protect them. The hospital's fever ward occupied the entire third floor. Patients were isolated from visitors, ostensibly to prevent infection. In reality, this isolation served a darker purpose. It allowed Whittemore and his staff to conduct experiments without oversight or interference. Staff members later described the fever ward as a place of constant screaming. Patients begged for water but were denied. They pleaded to see their family members but were told visitors were forbidden. Some claimed to hear drilling and sawing late at night, sounds that hospital administrators dismissed as construction work. But construction doesn't explain the smell. Multiple witnesses described a terrible odor emanating from the third floor, a mixture of chemicals, decay, and something else they couldn't identify, something that made their stomachs turn and their hands shake. This was the world Margaret Collins entered on October 15, 1874, a world where hope went to die, and where people disappeared not just from life, but from memory itself. Thomas Collins returned to Bellevue Hospital the morning after admitting his wife. He carried flowers from their garden and a letter from Margaret's mother, along with hope that her fever had broken overnight.
Instead, he found confusion and contradictions. The nurse at the reception desk claimed no record of Margaret Collins being admitted. When Thomas insisted, showing the admission paperwork he'd received the night before, the nurse examined it carefully and declared it a forgery. Thomas demanded to speak with Dr. Whittemore. After an hour of waiting, Whittemore appeared, calm and professional. He listened to Thomas's story with apparent sympathy, then delivered devastating news. "Mr. Collins," Whittemore said, "I believe you may be suffering from grief-induced delusion. Our records show no one by that name has been admitted to this facility. Perhaps your wife sought treatment elsewhere." Thomas exploded in anger. He had carried Margaret through these very doors. He had signed papers. He had spoken with nurses and orderlies. How could there be no record? Whittemore suggested Thomas visit other hospitals in the city. He even provided a list of facilities that treated fever patients. But he maintained that Margaret Collins had never set foot in Bellevue. Thomas spent the next 3 days searching every hospital, clinic, and medical facility in Richmond. No one had seen Margaret. No one had any record of her admission anywhere. She had simply vanished. While Thomas Collins searched desperately for his missing wife, something strange was happening on the third floor of Bellevue Hospital. A new patient had appeared in the fever ward, one who didn't match any admission records. Hospital staff referred to her only as Patient 000. She was young, with auburn hair and green eyes, and she seemed to be recovering from a severe illness, but there was something deeply wrong with her. Patient 000 couldn't remember her name. She couldn't recall where she lived, who her family was, or how she had arrived at the hospital. When nurses asked her questions, she stared at them blankly, as if the words made no sense. More disturbing were the physical changes. Orderlies noted that patient 000 had scars on her scalp, thin lines that suggested recent surgical procedures. She complained of headaches and dizziness. Sometimes she would scream in the night, but when staff arrived to check on her, she couldn't explain why. Dr. Whittemore took a particular interest in patient 000. He visited her daily, conducting what he called memory reconstruction therapy. The sessions took place in a locked room in the hospital basement, and no other staff members were permitted to observe. After these sessions, patient 000 would return to the fever ward in a dazed state. She would sit by the window for hours, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face for reasons she couldn't explain. Other patients in the ward began to whisper among themselves. They noticed that patient 000 would sometimes mutter words under her breath, fragments of sentences that made no sense. Thomas, the wedding dress, Clay Street. But when questioned about these words, she would look confused and claim she had never said them. As weeks passed, Thomas Collins refused to give up searching for his wife. He hired private investigators, placed advertisements in newspapers, and offered rewards for information. His desperate efforts began to attract attention from unexpected sources. A former Bellevue hospital orderly named James Murphy approached Thomas in November 1874. Murphy had quit his job at the hospital suddenly, claiming he could no longer stomach what he witnessed there. Murphy told Thomas about patient 000, describing a young woman with auburn hair who had appeared on the fever ward around the same time Margaret had vanished. He described the woman's amnesia, her scars, and her disturbing sessions with Dr. Whitmore. "She looks just like the woman in the newspaper photograph," Murphy told Thomas. "But when I mentioned the name Margaret Collins to her, she just stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language." Murphy revealed more disturbing details about Bellevue's operations. He described a basement laboratory where Dr. Whitmore conducted experiments on unconscious patients. He told of surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, of patients who entered the hospital as one person and left as someone completely different. "Whitmore believes he can erase memories and replace them," Murphy explained. "He thinks he's advancing medical science, but what he's really doing is destroying human souls." Thomas demanded to know why Murphy hadn't spoken up sooner. The former orderly's answer chilled him to the bone. Because the last person who tried to expose what was happening there ended up as a patient himself, and he never made it out. Thomas Collins faced an impossible situation. If patient 000 was his wife, how could he prove it to someone who no longer remembered being Margaret Collins? And if he tried to expose Dr. Whitmore's crimes, would he meet the same fate as previous whistleblowers? The answer came from an unexpected source: Margaret's own diary. Thomas had kept Margaret's personal belongings, including the leather-bound journal where she recorded her thoughts and daily activities. Rereading through her entries, he found detailed descriptions of a distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon.
If patient 000 was Margaret, she would have the same birthmark. But getting close enough to check would require infiltrating one of the most secure medical facilities in Richmond. Thomas needed help, and he found it among a growing network of people who had lost family members to Bellevue's fever ward. Sarah Henderson had lost her brother to the hospital in September. William Torres had lost his daughter in early October. Elizabeth Murray had lost her elderly mother just days before Margaret's admission. All had similar stories. Family members admitted for fever treatment who simply vanished from hospital records. All had been told by Dr. Whitmore that they were suffering from grief-induced delusions. Together, they began planning something unprecedented: a coordinated investigation into Bellevue Medical Hospital's darkest secrets. On December 3, 1874, Thomas Collins and his allies executed a desperate plan. Using inside information from James Murphy and 2 other former hospital employees, they infiltrated Bellevue during the night shift when security was lightest. Their goal was simple: reach the 3rd-floor fever ward and document evidence of the hospital's crimes, including proof that patient 000 was actually Margaret Collins. The group split into teams. Thomas and Sarah Henderson headed for the fever ward, while the others secured escape routes and watched for guards. They had maybe 20 minutes before their presence would be discovered. The 3rd floor of Bellevue Hospital at night was a vision from hell. Patients moaned in their beds, many restrained with leather straps. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. In the dim gaslight, shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Thomas found patient 000 in a small room at the end of the ward. She was awake, sitting by the window and humming a melody he recognized, the song Margaret had sung on their wedding day. "Margaret," he whispered. The woman turned toward him, and Thomas's heart nearly stopped. It was Margaret's face, but her eyes were empty, devoid of recognition. She looked at him as she might look at a stranger on the street. "Do I know you?" she asked in Margaret's voice. Thomas moved closer, desperately hoping for any sign of recognition. "I'm your husband, Thomas Collins. We were married in July. Do you remember?" Patient 000 tilted her head, considering. I think I've dreamed about you. But dreams aren't real, are they?" Thomas knew he only had moments before discovery. He asked patient 000 to show him her left shoulder, claiming he needed to check for fever signs. When she pulled aside her hospital gown, Thomas saw what he had prayed he wouldn't find, a crescent-shaped birthmark. Patient 000 was Margaret Collins. But before Thomas could react, shouts erupted from the hallway. Guards had discovered the intruders. As footsteps pounded toward their room, Thomas grabbed Margaret's hand and looked into her confused eyes. "I will find a way to bring you home. I will never stop trying." Then he ran, leaving his wife behind in that terrible place, not knowing if he would ever see her again. The break-in at Bellevue Hospital created a crisis for Dr. Whitmore and his associates. Thomas Collins and his group had gathered enough evidence to expose the hospital's illegal experiments, but more importantly, they had identified patient 000 as Margaret Collins. Whitmore acted swiftly to contain the damage. He contacted Richmond's mayor, police chief, and several prominent businessmen who had invested in his experimental treatments. A meeting was held at the mayor's mansion on December 5, 1874. The decision was unanimous. The scandal must be buried. Within days, Thomas Collins found himself facing criminal charges for breaking and entering. The other members of his group were arrested on various pretexts. James Murphy, the former orderly who had helped them, disappeared entirely. Local newspapers, which had been covering the story of missing fever patients, suddenly stopped reporting on the issue. Editors claimed there was no credible evidence of wrongdoing at Bellevue Hospital. Most devastatingly for Thomas, patient 000 vanished from the fever ward. When he tried to file a missing person report, police told him no such patient had ever existed at Bellevue Hospital. Once again, Margaret Collins had disappeared. But this time, Thomas had proof. Photographs taken during the night raid, documents copied from hospital files, and testimony from multiple witnesses. He was determined to use this evidence to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Thomas Collins spent his life savings on lawyers and private investigators. He published pamphlets describing his wife's disappearance and the horrors of Bellevue Hospital. He testified before city councils and wrote letters to newspapers across the country. His efforts yielded fragments of a larger, more terrifying truth. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore was not just conducting unauthorized medical experiments, he was selling the results to wealthy clients who paid enormous sums for procedures that could erase traumatic memories or implant new ones. Prominent Richmond families had used Whitmore's services to hide scandals, eliminate witnesses, or even dispose of inconvenient relatives.
The fever epidemic had provided perfect cover for these crimes, allowing dozens of people to disappear without investigation.
Patient 000 was not Whitmore's only success. Hospital records revealed at least 30 other cases of memory reconstruction therapy performed on fever patients. Most had died during the procedures. Those who survived were relocated to distant asylums or sold to wealthy families as servants who could never reveal their origins because they couldn't remember them. Margaret Collins had survived the initial procedure but retained fragments of her original memories. This made her too dangerous to release, but too valuable to eliminate. She had become Whitmore's prize experiment, a living test subject for increasingly extreme procedures. In 1876, Thomas Collins received a letter that changed everything. It was from a woman named Mary Sullivan, who worked as a nurse at Western State Lunatic Asylum in Staunton, Virginia. Mary had read Thomas's pamphlets about his missing wife. She believed she had seen Margaret Collins, now living under the identity of Jane Smith, a patient with no memory of her past, who had been transferred from Richmond 2 years earlier. Thomas traveled to Staunton immediately. What he found there broke his heart and gave him hope in equal measure. Jane Smith was indeed Margaret Collins, though she bore little resemblance to the vibrant woman he had married. Years of medical experimentation had left her frail and confused. She spoke in whispers and flinched whenever anyone approached too quickly. But something miraculous had happened during her time at Western State. Away from Dr. Whitmore's influence, tiny fragments of her original memories had begun to return. She remembered Thomas's face, though she couldn't recall his name. She hummed their wedding song without knowing why. She would sometimes cry when it rained, remembering without understanding a rainy day when she had been happy. Thomas spent hours with Margaret, showing her photographs and telling stories from their brief time together. Slowly, painfully, pieces of her identity began to emerge from the fog of amnesia. But the woman who emerged was not the Margaret Collins who had entered Bellevue Hospital in 1874. She was someone new, someone forged by trauma and loss into something both heartbreaking and miraculous. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore's crimes eventually caught up with him, but not through the justice system. In 1878, he was found dead in his private laboratory at Bellevue Hospital, apparently killed by one of his own experimental devices. The official cause of death was listed as accidental electrocution, but those who knew Whitmore's work suspected something different. They believed he had become his own final test subject, attempting to erase his own memories of the crimes he had committed. His death led to the closure of Bellevue's experimental ward and the release of several patients who had been held there under false identities. But for most of Whitmore's victims, it was too late. They had been lost to families who never learned their fate, buried in unmarked graves or living forgotten lives in distant institutions. Margaret Collins was one of the fortunate few. She left Western State Asylum in 1879, returning to Richmond with Thomas, who had never stopped believing in their love. Their reunion was not the fairy tale ending Margaret might have written in her diary. She remained fragile and confused, prone to nightmares and sudden fears. She could not remember their wedding day or their brief time as newlyweds. But she chose to stay with Thomas not because she remembered loving him, but because she learned to love him again. They had 3 children together, and Margaret lived to be 67 years old, dying peacefully in 1919. She never fully recovered her original memories, but she created new ones, better ones, built on the foundation of a love strong enough to survive even the complete erasure of identity. Today, the building that once housed Bellevue Medical Hospital stands abandoned in downtown Richmond. Local authorities have sealed the entrances, but urban explorers still find ways inside, drawn by stories of the horrors that occurred there. They report strange phenomena, voices echoing from empty rooms, shadows moving through halls where no one walks, and most disturbing of all, the sound of someone crying on the third floor, where the fever ward once operated. Margaret Collins's story became a rallying cry for medical ethics reform in the late 19th century. Her case, along with others exposed by Thomas's relentless advocacy, led to new laws requiring patient consent and family notification for experimental procedures. But her story also serves as a reminder of how easily people can disappear, how quickly identities can be erased, and how vulnerable we all are when we place our trust in those who hold power over our lives. The records of Dr. Whitmore's experiments were never found. Some believe they were destroyed after his death. Others think they remain hidden somewhere, waiting to reveal the full extent of his crimes. What we know for certain is this: Margaret Collins entered Bellevue Hospital as a bride full of hopes and dreams. She emerged as patient 000, a woman without a past. Her journey back to identity, back to love, back to life itself stands as proof that even in our darkest moments, even when everything we are has been stripped away, something essential remains. Something that cannot be erased, no matter how hard anyone tries. Something that, given time and love and determination, can grow back into a whole human being. Margaret Collins proved that we are more than our memories. We are more than our past. We are the love we give and receive, the connections we forge, and the choices we make each day to be human in a world that sometimes seems determined to strip our humanity away. Her story ended not with the recovery of what was lost, but with the creation of something new and beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And perhaps that is the most human miracle of all. What secrets do you think still lie buried in abandoned hospitals across America? The medical horrors of the past remind us why patient rights matter today. Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep this conversation alive.